And we're live. Welcome to the podcast. Today we're going to be talking about the origins of virtue signaling and egalitarianism in the West. So go ahead, Gandalfi. Lead the discussion and tell us what you know about the Enlightenment period and if you think the Enlightenment was the catalyst for the beginning of egalitarianism and it kind of sowed the seeds for modernity. Or you strictly think that it was just the modern era in America is strictly kind of the origin of, it originates in the 1960s. Tell me your opinion on that.
Well, let's just put it this way. America, certainly the 1960s with the sexual revolution destroying the kind of patriarchy and the Mannerbund necessary for white society to produce strong men and strong families, certainly that has greatly accelerated the decline. But America has marinated in this kind of 18th century Enlightenment thinking since the beginning. I mean, the Constitution, the very kind of Whiggish politics that both Hamilton and Jefferson and Madison all had when the constitutional republic that, formerly known as the United States was created, that was all marinating in this Enlightenment kind of background. And that Enlightenment background is most centered in merry old England.
Okay.
And it's the Anglo attitude toward life. It's the joie de vivre of Anglo society, especially in the 18th century and onward. But even before that, that sort of set the West into a period of, I think, its terminal decline.
Would you say that the seeds of kind of egalitarianism was laid in the French Revolution or previously?
Well, what the French Revolution did, although American society was actually more perfectly egalitarian in a certain way than the French Revolution.
Yeah, but from what I understand, the whole social contract, the notions of democracy comes from de Tocqueville, and it's a mixture of kind of French Enlightenment thinking, people like Voltaire, de Tocqueville, and others, combined with an Anglo-Saxon type law system or a document like the Magna Carta.
Critical of democracy. He didn't see it ending well. He saw it ending in either anarchy or tyranny.
Oh, so you're saying de Tocqueville was critical of democracy? I didn't know that.
Yeah, de Tocqueville was what came from the old ancien regime, the pre-French Revolution regime, and so that was kind of.
So he was pro-monarchy.
Yes, I mean he certainly recognized the dynamism of democracy and that democracy was the future. I mean, he saw America as the future kind of society. He didn't have much hope that throne and altar could come back, but he certainly preferred them.
I see. I don't understand much about this era in the West, in Western history. I should research it more and study it more. I read a little bit of Rousseau and a little bit of Voltaire and a bunch of other Enlightenment thinkers. I know from Rousseau, you start to see the groundworks in, what would become known as virtue signaling. It's just my opinion, not my theory, that stuff like virtue signaling originates with people like Rousseau and their whole concept of, the whole sophisticated savage or whatever.
The myth of the noble.
Yeah, the noble savage. I mean, the noble savage. Yes, the whole myth about the noble savage comes from Rousseau, and I kind of look at it as an early form of virtue signaling, and sort of that combined with this whole notion that I don't know, the Puritans kind of leads to this kind of white guilt that we see in the modern society. I mean, granted, it is kind of stoked by, Jews and like other agitations in our society, but it does seem like the groundwork was laid there within white society and it was easily exploited.
Yeah,
what do you think?
I think the Jews were just an opportunistic infection.
Okay.
I mean,
I'm just trying to understand the genesis of white guilt and where exactly it originated and where it came from, because I know that it has an extensive history that goes beyond even the modern even in modern times. It goes beyond the 60s. I don't buy that it just sprout up against in the 60s, especially in the upper classes.
Well, white guilt's is a complicated question. I think from the 60s on, I mean, a lot of it is Jew programming.
Okay.
But whites are conscientious people. I mean, whites create societies where there's a lot of internal controls within individual persons. I mean, white people are very, when they're healthy, they're very interdirected. But the shadow side of that is a self-critic. Now, the problem is the Jews in the post-World War II era, through the use of the education system and the mass media that they controlled, became the internal critic.
Well, I understand that, but from what I understand, from what I was reading, remember that whole essay that was written by Hunter Wallace a while back, talking about civic nationalism? You remember that essay?
Yeah, it's about a year and a half ago now.
I don't think it's that far back. There's a essay where him and Greg Johnson was like debating each other about civic nationalism, I believe. How basically white nationalists should probably reject American nationalism and not utilize it because it's ineffective, and it just will repeat itself once it's embraced.
I'm a believer in that same thing.
Okay.
I think the American nation, in some sense, and there was an article on Countercurrents to this effect, the title is escaping me. On some level, when we desegregated in the early 60s and let blacks become equal citizens, even right before we did Hart-Celler, we threw away our nationhood. Because for the most part, blacks are really not part of our heritage in that way. We already, in the political order, sort of spiritually miscegenated. And the American nation became a fiction. So the reality of a nice white country became, a pile of mud and sludge. So reviving American nationalism, well, it's just not possible because you no longer have an American nation.
Well, I'm just saying that's the popular consensus now. Is we should put white nationalism under the banner of like American nationalism. I know there's a lot of conflicted opinions in the camp about this because it's mainly for more wide scale appeal, and it might work. I don't know, but burger nationalism might work. I just don't know. I'm skeptical of this notion ever taking off. But then again, I'm just a pessimist. In most cases, I just see America's kind of like done for.
I would tend to agree with you. I'm highly pessimistic myself, and I do think America is done. I think it's time to kind of follow what Billy Roper says. It's the alt-right needs to become the bulk right.
Well, the state secessionists should at least be enacted in most cases, since clearly there's like two divided power structures in this country, one in the deep state in Washington D.C. and the other on the coastal areas, which are vastly culturally different from people in flyover states.
Yeah. And I think the people in these flyover states, I don't think they really want, they're gradually becoming self-conscious of themselves, and they don't want anything to do with the global homo gayplex anymore.
Pretty much no, they don't. With some few outliers in the flyover states, with a bunch of degenerates like Redneck Revolt and other groups, most people still want a traditionalist life, and that's what they aspire to.
Yeah, they want to have families and communities and hopefully local middle-class jobs.
But anyway, let's get back to the Enlightenment era, and let's talk a little bit about how do you think the seeds of the, do you think like America was a fresh start from Europe, or do you think like it kind of carried over many egalitarian principles it adapted from the Enlightenment period? I mean, what's your opinion on that?
I think demographically, considering how crowded Europe had become and how warlike Europe had become, North America and the United States was a safety valve for population. But when Europeans immigrated over to North America, they brought with them all this egalitarian ferment, and America was cursed with that, and we've not been able to escape that because
Well,
that.
like for instance, there's like, it seems like there's like there was multiple revolutions going on from the French down to the 1848. There's multiple revolutions that occurred, and there's like a partisan. There's like a partisan fracture and a fight between all these different factions. The Democrats. Well, not the sense of the modern day Democrats, but the liberals, Democrats, and kind of the radicals. We're fighting each other and vying for who would control Europe at the time. And it seems like in most cases, like in Germany, they won. The monarchy won, I believe. The nation state won, and the monarchs won against the different socialist factions that were fighting it out. And it seems like the seeds of there's a lot of like descendants of these socialists that are living in America now. I don't know if that has a factor or not. But many of these people, they were called the 1849ers, and I'm pretty sure they probably carried some of their politics with them to America, and probably solidified many of the liberal tendencies, many of the egalitarian tendencies that existed within the population.
But at the same time, one of the things that made, say, the German immigrants much different was that although they were egalitarian and certainly had some of these romantic and Enlightenment views, when it came to labor, and work, their view of these things wasn't as friendly to the kind of Anglo capital.
Well, I'm not saying they were like classical. I'm not saying they were like modern day socialists, like Bernie Sanders socialist. I was simply saying that they did have notions of egalitarian and romanticism in that regards.
But with the thing that mitigated that somewhat among the Germanic peoples is there is still very much, compared to further Western Europe, a very strong sense of the Volk. And
are you sure that applied though to the 1849ers that were kicked out of like this is before Germany was a nation?
I think sort of Germany becoming a nation was already kind of set in stone by 1848. It was going to happen within a generation anyway by that time. I don't know.
Are you aware of this revolution though? How I believe it was a bunch of students took up arms and tried to unify. I don't know if they were trying to unify Germany or simply break off from Germany. Oh, well, not Germany, but break off from the nation, from from the empire that existed there at the time. Hello?
Yeah, I'm here. I'm not. Well, most of the student rebellion, didn't that occur in like the Rhineland?
No, it occurred, I think, somewhere around Berlin, or I think it extended into like Bavaria. I'm not really sure. I have to look that up.
Yeah, I gotta relook up the 1848 revolution as it played out in the German nation states north of Austria-Hungary.
But many people might think that these things are like too obscure to discuss them or connect them to the modern era. But I don't know. I think they probably laid the groundwork for many later, kind of leftist revolutions in America.
Well, even though France had, the bloody regicide, I mean, you could make a case that America has been a much more perfectly leftist country.
Well, I mean, they'd argue that it's classical liberalism, that the whole Lockean and Hobbesian type of, classical liberalism as they say, that really didn't extend to any kind of universalism.
Yeah, but once you put those ideas out there and make those ideas rather than sort of thrown an altar, the foundation of your polity, I mean, you've opened yourself up to radical leftism. There's no way to really control it. I mean, we went from a country where you had to be a property owning, tax paying landowner to vote to hey, illegals can cross the border or live in sanctuary cities and vote.
I mean, what I'm trying to say is that, do you think there's like anything within the early America that would be considered third positionist?
No. And you know, some people might say, and I know we have some friends who say it, like the Federalist Party,
Yeah, the Federalists, they claim.
but
you don't agree with that?
Like put down the Whiskey Rebellion. The they managed to protect the United States from the XYZ affair when France tried to break up the United States, essentially, and of course the Alien and Sedition Acts. But I mean, there was no real kind of economic doctrine at that point, and there was so much kind of chaos on the frontier, or at least like non-governmentality. It's hard to say that that very short decade and a half period was really anything of a third position that was sort of
okay. I see. So nothing like prototypical, because I mean, I don't know if this is like can be verified, but I kind of think I see the French Revolution as being kind of a precursor to stuff like communism. I kind of see it as like a precursor that would lay the foundations from communism even before Marx.
Well, I think that's definitely the case. I mean, because if you go back to if you go you've to the end of the Napoleonic Wars, and then you look at the future problems in France, like the early 1830s revolution. Well, that revolution inspired a reaction in England with the Chartist movement, which was really an attempt to extend the franchise to vote for parliament beyond the landholding class. So in Europe, because of the French Revolution, because of the Napoleonic Wars, and because of future agitations even after that, the path toward mass suffrage democracy was well underway by the 1830s.
I see. I brought you on here, because I'm vastly ignorant. I admit I'm vastly ignorant of this, this era in history. I'm more into classical European civilization than I am to the Enlightenment period or even stuff like the Reformation. I find some of the wars in the French Revolution to be interesting because of what it says about populist movements and overthrowing of monarchies in regards to the modern era. I find that to be interesting, but I don't know much about any era afterwards or really before during like the medieval period. I mean, can you tell me more about kind of Enlightenment philosophy?
Well,
like, yeah, you were discussing like, I don't mean to interrupt you. You were discussing like Locke and I think in the chat with with someone with another friend on there, and I'd be honest with you, I haven't really read Locke, very much.
Well, Locke is pretty shitty, if you ask me. And well, Locke's biggest influence within the early American elite was obviously Thomas Jefferson. I mean, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness was stolen from Locke's belief that life, liberty, and property were the basis for a liberal political order. But Locke, Rousseau, and Hobbes all are social contractarians.
Okay.
With the 18th century sort of weakening the idea of a personal God rooted in Christian revelation, where the church was really
Yeah, the divine right of kings, right?
Yeah, but even deeper than that, where the church was seen as this institution which was kind of the vessel for the entire national community, that really had started to weaken in the 18th century. And the Enlightenment worked to fill in that void with all these principles of liberty, these abstractions, and with all the mercantile wealth flowing in, they could kind of create this ideology of property and money and this kind of spirit around it to substitute for the waning belief in the old revelation based Christian religion. And the social contract was this: we're free, we're rich, we're merchants, and this is the basis for liberty. It's not the shared sacrifice of a community united in Christ anymore. All of the confessional wars, particularly the 30 Years' Wars of the 17th century, and the continued struggle in France and England and over Protestantism and Catholicism, had simply just exhausted the elite's belief that religion was and the church was what was the source of national unity.
So this was like was this a turn off your mic? It's like echoing.
My mic?
Well, I think you have the YouTube on.
I don't have YouTube on at all.
Okay, well it's hold on a minute, maybe it's me. A minute. Nope, I have my mic muted.
Hold on, let me.
I'm getting echo.
Okay, I'm muting.
Okay. What I'm trying to say, is that was this a ground up type of thought process, or was this kind of a from above? Was this from the Bub hierarchy that decided to do this, or was this kind of the peasant class deciding this philosophy? Where exactly did this philosophical concept of egalitarianism originate from? Now, many people that are conspiratorial would say that perhaps it originated from the various lodges and salons, which were fronts for Masonic, lodges and participation from various different secret societies. What's your opinion on that?
Well, England was a hothouse for secret societies. If you go back to the 30 Years' War, which is the war that basically finished the established churches. I mean, the Roman Catholic Church was never the same after the 30 Years' War, and the established churches in the Protestant parts of Europe were just the playthings of the elites thereafter. One of the things that happened during the 30 Years' War, and Terence McKenna, incidentally, the kind of boomer hippie stoner
Terence McKenna,
great
hallucination man.
Yes,
the shroom man.
He does have a great little bit about the most important and underreported aspect of the 30 Years' War was the kind of the rebellion in Bohemia, where kind of the kind of what should I call it? The occult beginnings of the Enlightenment and all this kind of Masonic secret societies began. And one of the people that was, of course, Bohemia was the center of it. Bohemia was completely destroyed by all the powers.
Was that Adam Westphal, or was that much later?
Adam Weishaupt was. He was a Bavarian Jesuit, but he was a carrier of those ideas in the 18th century. In the 17th century, the Elector Palatine, who was the king of Bohemia, well, it was he and his wife who created kind of this Rosicrucian society, the Rosicrucian elite. And the Rosicrucians had a major impact upon kind of like the followers of Francis.
Yeah, Francis Bacon, yeah.
Yeah. In particular, one occult.
John Dee. John Dee, yeah. The Enochian magic type thing that inspired Crowley.
Yeah, well, inspired the entire English aristocracy at the time. And I have to do more research on this myself to
Same here.
Exactly how when John Dee and the Rosicrucian Enlightenment started really entering deeply into the bowels of the English elite, what that did to English culture in more subtle and politics in more subtle ways. But needless to say, these ideas were very much these kind of neo-alchemical ideas. We were very concerned with the material expansion and manipulation of the universe. And, kind of a hallmark of Western society as started by the Anglos has been the material manipulation of the universe. I mean, one of the things that happened in England in the generation before the American Revolution was the invention of the steam engine. So
Are you saying that you're a Luddite? You're not a Luddite, are you?
no, but I'm saying that the kind of spiritual ferment in which something like the steam engine happened is around the time when England was kind of playing around with usury.
Okay.
When the masses weren't quite on to, wanting that back, the English elite were already into it. The Jews were already back in England thanks to William of Orange.
And Cromwell.
Before that, Cromwell, but William of Orange allowed the Jews to have the charter on the fucking national bank.
He's despised in Ireland.
Cromwell? Well, yeah.
William of Orange too, as well.
William of Orange probably tried to do stuff to reinstate the Church of England and dethrone the church.
Now, does this have any tie into the Jacobians at all?
Jacobeans? Well,
Jacobeans, I mean.
Many of the early Jacobeans were Masons.
Okay. Interesting.
And I'm still trying to figure out how much, say, John Dee and the Rosicrucian Enlightenment, figures into the development of, say, Scottish Rite Freemasonry.
From what I understand, there's like the Blue Lodge is kind of the non kind of paused masonry, from what I understand. Hello?
Yeah, I'm here.
From what I understand, the Blue Lodge is kind of the non-paused, version of masonry.
All kind of paused?
Blue Lodge, I think it is a direct descendant of the Scottish Rite, but I'm not very certain about that. See, to me, masonry only has significance as a threat in like somehow during the medieval era and during the kind of leading up to the French Revolution and maybe a little bit further down. I don't subscribe to them having much prominence in modern day America or Europe. I don't see them as having, any kind of as being part of kind of an elite. But I don't know, maybe. I know you have like various other people like conspiracy theorists will say stuff like the Club of Rome is a prominent fixture. They'll say the Jesuits, and they'll I just think it's like Jewish bankers and sellout Anglo elite in our country that want to like globally expand kind of American culture everywhere and open the borders so they can have more consumerists, so they'll buy more like useless trinkets and kind of miscegenate into like one big amalgam. So they won't have an identity and they can't contest kind of the people in the upper spheres of, the elites.
Yeah. And it's important that you talked about, okay, where did this revolution come from? It came from the upper class.
Well, the middle class, to what I understand.
Well, the moneyed middle class.
Okay. That's usually
because
where
money began as England was expanding and creating this kind of seafaring naval empire, and had things like the East India Company and whatnot. The landed aristocracy began to have less power. It was the moneyed class that could access and control these capital flows that began to be decisive over politics. The British Navy and the British merchant class began to dominate. And so these ideas, these kind of Enlightenment ideas, fit with their agenda to expand their control of capital.
So is this a valid subject, or is this something kind of too obscure or arcane to discuss in terms of relevance to modern America?
It's a valid subject, but it requires. It's a valid subject. It requires. I mean, while I know a lot of the facts about what went on here, exactly how this worked, I'm thinking we're talking this over is going to. It just requires a lot more careful thought and reflection.
Oh, definitely.
Now that I think,
I just opened up the stream just to discuss this further because it's always been an interest of mine, and I don't know much about it, but I always hear people toss around Enlightenment principles in political discussions, and I don't know much about it. It's not a main area of interest for me, but it's something I'd like to get to know, further. I'd like someone to expound upon it. Hello?
Well, yeah, I'm here. I think what's interesting is because I think the relevance of this question is we need to figure out how we got to this place of insane leftism, this kind of, and how this cultural Marxist rot sunk so deeply. I mean, there was something kind of in the cultural milieu, and it's not just Jews, that allowed.
That's what I'm saying. I keep trying to tell people that. I mean, don't get me wrong. I believe the Jews should be on the hook for, for subversion in our country, and they're definitely responsible for a lot of the modern phenomenon. But there had to be something about, the European race that allowed them to subvert. There had to be something about our character that allowed kind of the Jews to take advantage. And I've been trying to explore that and find it. And the conclusion I came up with was it had to be somewhere during the Enlightenment where things, went bad for Europe.
Mm-hmm.
And it kind of, like, you do see a little bit of Western chauvinism, during the 1800s into the 1920s with people like Lothrop Stoddard and Madison Grant, which had, high readership. But it seems that this was just a residual kind of characteristic of European chauvinism, that many of the upper classes had a tendency to embrace kind of egalitarianism. You can see this in kind of the Anglo elite pushing various different kind of even eugenics at the time was considered kind of progressive, although I think that's a good practice. But you can see some progressive kind of tendencies in like the upper classes that led to kind of this white guilt.
Well,
and then solidified itself in the postmodern era.
Well, one of the things that, in speaking about race science, I know Julius Evola I think it was Riding the Tiger. Julius Evola would talk about how, like, the Nordic countries, he was speaking specifically of like Sweden and Denmark and whatnot, were so advanced in their sort of in their science that they were kind of setting themselves up for a fall, because the way in which their science manifested was so materialistic. There was kind of a rot in the center of it. And that in the end, because their scientific exploits weren't unified to kind of like the inner spiritual structure of life, that these kind of scientific material exploits would be turned against the society itself. And I think that's kind of what's been happening throughout the West, but also particularly in America for a long time now. Our material prosperity has sort of isolated us from our communities. And it's this individualism and atomization which has left us open to all this other deeper manipulation. I mean, like, think about porn. I mean, porn wouldn't spread like wildfire if people were living in much denser relations in multifamily houses again, or multi-generational family houses again. It'd be harder to sneak into your room to like jack off to porn, for instance. And I'm just using as potential example for how things happen. But white people and how they relate with their families and friends, we're just very isolated. It makes us much more susceptible to emotional manipulation and social programming.
No, do you think that that individualistic streak though kind of comes from also from Enlightenment principles?
There's a cultural historian, Franz Borkenau, that he did in a collection of essays. He did he tried to look at language and why the West was so individualistic, and it turns out like first person singular pronouns can actually be traced back to like the Eddas and sagas of the Vikings.
Interesting.
The Enlightenment. So this stuff didn't emerge in the Enlightenment. It might be sort of something that's a part of our actual character as people. I think the Enlightenment just caused this expression of our character to become hyper individualized and therefore prone to be vulnerable to that which would break down our communal bonds. I know you're making me think about this a lot more carefully, and I'm trying to come up with my best thinking on it.
I mean, I used to frequent this blog. I used to read some of the responses, and basically the way they were describing the kind of the alt-right is they were saying that they were basically people who reject Enlightenment principles. They believe Enlightenment principles are kind of don't have any basis in reality. That's what someone was describing as. And granted, this is like a neocon blog. It's a boring neocon blog from a guy that I used to follow on when I used to read human biodiversity blogs. And this guy was discussing this, some of the commenters. I like to read some of the comments sometime to see, how where these people's minds are at. And this is what they said. They stated this. This is where I got this from.
Yeah.
I haven't had the time really to research it. I don't know much about the Reformation or any of that era in European history. I know I'm kind of a bad white nationalist, or I'm a bad white nationalist because I don't know much about that era. I was never into neo-reactionary.
Well, I think the neo-reactionaries, I'm thinking like the guys over at Social Man, tend to be a bit spurgy, particularly Nick Steves. But there's some value to some of that, because when our societies were, at least amongst the upper class, are filled with very strong and vital people, was, well, when we had throne and altar controlling things. And, well, we haven't had that in such a long time. Not been good. And I'm starting to wonder more and more if lacking that's been much worse for us than we imagined. I mean, the only real correction that has happened against liberalism, and even then it might not have worked had war not intervened, was really fascism in the 20s and 30s. It was an attempt to sort of slow down the degeneracy, unite the people into a revolt, and have a leader and a vanguard steer the people back toward eugenic living and high civilization. I think we've been in a long, long denouement, and I think the NRXers might make the case too far, but they're certainly not far off. That when the egalitarian mob runs things, I mean, you eventually just lose everything over time.
The populist mob, it's the rise of the populist mob. I mean, that is kind of something that can be traced to the French Revolution. I mean, that's something I can't think of many other incidents in history where the populist mob kind of won. Can you?
No, but I will say about the current populist moment is very different than, say, maybe like say the student rebellions of the late '60s. Current
Yeah.
populist rebellion that's going on now. See, populism can mean many things. Is I think on an instinctual level, people know that their societies are degenerate and corrupt, and the current ruling elite has imposed a regime of political repression and economic inequality, which just can't be sustained any longer. That the ability to tolerate it is just going down.
Okay, Gandalfi. I'm gonna like ask you for like concluding statements and your thoughts on the Enlightenment, Anglo philosophy, and uh, the origins of virtue signaling and egalitarianism.
Okay, concluding thoughts. England, England is really the most important Reformation power and the most important maritime power. Pretty much all of um, the craziest occult elements of the Enlightenment, the aggressive materialism, the aggressive capitalism, the aggressive acquisitiveness in general of Western European man found its true heart in England. I mean, Oswald Spengler said the soul of England is that of the people of a pirate ship. America as a
Yeah,
country.
he had a theory about kind of land based civilization and maritime based civilization. I believe that was part of his theory of different civilizations.
Well,
Categorization.
in that sense, he wouldn't be, other classic geopolitical thinkers like the British Mackinder and the American Nicholas Spickman wouldn't have disagreed. But needless to say, the North America was largely founded as a British settler colony, and Americans, the early Americans from the mid to late 17th and early 18th century, brought with them the whole cultural milieu of ideas which had been marinating in England. And this principle of kind of ordered individual liberty became the highest good, and revolving around it was material acquisition. No other real cultural glue held together
I think that's
early.
what they call transactional, a kind of transactional basis for civilization instead of a kind of a basis of something more abstract.
Or
Is that correct?
that's correct, but more importantly, we lacked a more sacralized understanding of what could have bound our civilization together.
Okay.
There was no unifying sacred principle. I mean, and we were a country with we were the first European country not to have a national church. We had a canon of saints, bishops, a common ritual that was relegated from the very beginning of this country to the private sphere, more or less. And because of that signaled already that we had kind of headed into a place where what bonded us together as a people was not something that could then be reproduced as something sacred.
Let's see.
It was just the abstract ideas that were ordered European people, pursuing settlement and property. Right then and there, a certain sacred dimension to our nationhood was already sundered and lost.
Interesting. I wish I could contribute more to this, but this is of interest, and I don't know much about the foundations of America. I know I'm a bad patriot. I'm not that familiar with the Enlightenment either, or a lot of that European history is kind of obscure to me. I prefer the classical Greco-Roman civilization as opposed to something like the Stoics and people like Marcus Aurelius and that era more so in antiquity than I do prefer the American civilization or the Enlightenment. But I'm gonna try to like research more about it. I put the stream up just to have a casual discussion since it's late at night, and I thought this might make an interesting topic.
I think it's a topic that it would be interesting to pursue it in, assuming I had the time and the money, book
So,
form.
so do you have any recommendations on someone that might want to familiarize themselves with this era
Well,
and this piece of
I
European
think it's
history?
important to look at the cultural influences of early America. And so David Hackett Fisher, I think he teaches at Brandeis University. He wrote this book in 1990.
Brandeis.
Yeah, well, it's still a great book.
Yeah.
David Hackett Fisher's Albion Seed.
Oh,
And
I've actually skimmed through Albion Seed.
I consider it like a maybe one of the most important books on early America you can find.
Nice. That's like how many pages is that?
Oh, like 800.
Have you read it through?
Oh, it's been a couple of years, but yes.
Maybe you can come on the stream someday and summarize Albion Seed.
Well, I can give you a 2-second one.
Okay.
There are 4 major cultural pathways from merry old England that influenced America. One is the Puritans. Most of the Puritans, think Oliver Cromwell and the English Revolution of the 1640s, were merchants who dwelled in East Anglia. The Puritans dominated Massachusetts, Rhode Island, and New England. The second major group, think Pennsylvania and the Delaware River Valley. Think the Quakers. And the Quakers come from the Midlands and the Moors further north, closer to the border with Scotland. A lot of them were involved in pastoralism, and their kind of egalitarianism had a very pastoral quality to it, although by the time they came to America, they were farmers. The whole kind of religion of the inner light and the spontaneity of community has kind of lasted for a long time with them. I mean, the greatest spiritual heirs to this would be the Amish. Then you go further south to a group like the Cavaliers and the Royalists, who formed a state like Virginia. And they're the high church Anglicans, honor culture, dueling culture, landed estates. I mean, they had the biggest ties to the landed aristocracy in England, the pre-chart.
And then you got the barbarians, which are the Ulster Scots.
Yes, and that's like the 4th major group.
Yeah, the Ulster Scots are my ancestors.
And they're the people that dominated Appalachia and the Northwest Territory.
Yeah, they're my ancestors.
Yeah,
along with the Welsh and the and the Bavarian German. Quite a mix. Quite a mix.
Quite a mix indeed. So that's kind of like the 2-minute summary of the 4 major cultural folkways that we inherited from England.
All right. Thank you guys for tuning in to our little brief introduction to the subject. Possibly we might be covering this subject in future streams, and we'll be talking about this. Maybe a little bit more high energy next time. We're kind of like half asleep, so the energy levels are not that high. But stay tuned. We're learning.
We'll move from Jeb Bush level to Donald Trump level.
Yeah, we're trying to get. No, forget that. We're going for Hyperborean level. We're going for Hyperborean, man. Forget right. Jeb Bush or even Donald Trump. We're going for esoteric Hyperborean level.
I love
Antarctic Natsosh level. Vril level. You ever heard of Vril?
Mm-hmm.
And that might be a good topic next time. Talk about Vril. Yeah, talk about that if you're familiar. All right. Anyway, I'm gonna close this off and signing out.
Signing out. A pleasure as always, Mr. Bateman.
Same here. Peace.
Peace.